to Tennessee's At-Home Learning series for literacy. Today's lesson is for all you 6th graders out there, though everyone is welcome to tune in. This lesson is the 5th in this week's series. My name is Megan Gilly, and I am a 6th grade teacher in Tennessee schools. I'm super excited to be your teacher for this final lesson for this week. Welcome to my virtual classroom. If you would like to visit this lesson or any of our previous lessons, you may go to the Tennessee Department of Education's website at www.tn.gov/education. Of course, you can still tune in if you haven't seen our other lessons, but it might be more fun if you go back and watch them, because what we do today, we'll be talking about things that we learned previously. Today, we will be looking at how a Greek myth is still relevant to today. Before we get started, to fully participate in our lesson today, you will need paper, a pen or pencil, a surface to write on, the independent practice from lesson 14, and the student packet for ELA grade 6 lesson 15, which can be found at the Tennessee Department of Education's website, again at www.tn.gov/education. Gather your materials and let's begin. I always like to start us off with a quick short review at the beginning of our lesson so we can reflect on what we have learned to prepare us for what we're going to learn. Let's think about the path of our learning. We'll look at a couple different slides. In lesson 11, we mainly just read to figure out what the story was about. It was about a mortal who had been transformed into a spider by Athena, a goddess or an immortal. In lesson 12, we studied the elements of the myth Arachne and how they led to the resolution. Do you remember the meaning of exposition? You're right. It's where the author reveals the characters in the main setting. Do you remember what word means a struggle between the main character and someone or something else first introduced in the exposition? That's right. When two opposing forces clash, it is called conflict. Can you think of the word that means development of the conflict, which leads to the climax? You're right, it's the rising action. And what about the word for the turning point, the most exciting part where you're on the edge of your seat? Great job. It is the climax. And lastly, this leads us all to the end of a story where the author describes the results of the climax and ties together the loose ends of the story. We call that our resolution. Great job. Then during lesson 13, we focused on conflict. Again, it is the major problem between the main character of the story and someone or something else. Who is the conflict again between in our text? That's right, the conflict is between Arachne and Athena. Again, Arachne is a mortal, she is a human, and Athena, who is a goddess and immortal. In the end, and as a result of the conflict, Athena turns Arachne into a spider. Then, in our last lesson, 14, we dove into how the author uses descriptions to help us understand the characters before and after Arachne's transformation into a spider. So I want you to take a moment to reread what you wrote if you did the assignment. And in just a moment, I will be reading an example to you. Again, you were asked to imagine that you were Arachne after the transformation and write a narrative telling us how you feel. So I want you to listen to how the student in this particular example used descriptive language to show how Arachne felt about her transformation into a spider. So follow along with me. I rise daily to the beautiful task of weaving threads of fine silk with my slender, agile legs. what to Athena was meant to be a curse has only allowed me to focus more on my skills, which only improve with each passing dewy morning. Now mortals pass and marvel at the glistening array of tapestries I have created. The pride Athena felt with her seemingly miserable punishment must haunt her as my works appear everywhere, even in her own home. My weaving is beyond anything Athena can fashion. I laugh at her attempts and plot to use my artistries for her demise. Ooh, that was very well written by a student. What did you hear? Did you hear how the student used details from the original text and from the chart? I heard descriptions of the spider's legs, but in a positive way. They were being described as both slender and agile, meaning ability to move easily and move quickly. The student also included details about the dewy morning and how the weaving glistens in the sun. It used phrases like glistening array, beautiful task, and my works appear everywhere. I also heard in the end, though, and those all have positive connotations, but in the end, she talks about how she wants revenge, to plot to use her artistries, meaning plan to use her weaving to show Athena just how successful she is being. Demise here means death, to use my artistries for her demise and death, meaning of her skill. So today our goal is to think about how ancient Greek origin myths are relevant to our lives today. We will begin with me showing you what that looks like as we read a new informational text. Then there will be time for us to work together to brainstorm what you want your myth to be about. And finally, I will assign you independent work that you can complete after the lesson ends. Like I said, today we will read an informational text, and it is titled, Why Ancient Greek Mythology is Still Important Today. I bet by looking at the title, you can already think about what the article will be about. What do you think the central idea is going to be of this text? If you said the importance of Greek myths, you are correct. This article gives a lot of good information about the importance of Greek myths, but it also gives us good information on the characteristics of Greek myths. So we will use the characteristics that we find in this article to compare to the Greek myth that we read this week, Arachne. Then we will also use these characteristics to help write our own Greek myth. So for starters, we're going to make a chart that we can use to help organize our thoughts and collect our evidence. With your paper and pencil, I would like for you to draw a header line and make a chart that has 3 columns like this. So 3 columns. On the left-hand side, I would like for you to label the column characteristics. C-H-A-R-A-C-T-E-R-I-S-T-I-C-S. Characteristics. We're looking for the important traits of a Greek myth as we read what the informational text tells us. Then, in the middle column, I want you to write Arachne in quotations because it is a story. A-R-A-C-H-N-E, Arachne. And lastly, in the third column, I want you to write my myth because that's where we're going to be thinking about the characteristics of a Greek myth and then what you want to use in your own myth after analyzing what Arachne uses. So are you ready? So let's again go ahead and take a look at this title one last time, and you'll see that it ends in ology. I'm sure that you've heard that before, right? It is the study of. What is it the study of? Well, myths. So when we think of this title, we really could reread it like, why is the study of ancient Greek myths still important today? So let's find out as we read. If there is one subject that still is widely taught today, it has to be the subject of ancient Greek mythology. It isn't just taught as part of a literature curriculum at school, but it is also part of most history lessons. Some people might wonder why the world is still so hung up on ancient Greek myths when they are nothing but stories and they came from thousands of years ago. However, one look at the vast amount, meaning the wide amount of ancient Greek-themed movies and literature today, people will quickly come to the conclusion that the world is still fascinated with Greek mythology, though they might not always be able to say why. In the last sentence, what do you think the word fascinated means? What is still fascinated? Yeah, I think it means that people are still interested in Greek mythology. We know this because of all the books and movies that have been created to retell these ancient stories. Have you ever heard or read the Percy Jackson books or seen the movies? Well, interesting. Or should I say fascinating? Let's keep reading. For those who think that ancient Greek mythology stories are nothing more than a bunch of outdated tales, they just happen to be wrong. For sure, these stories may have been written hundreds if not thousands of years ago, but it is good to remember they were written by wise men who had a hand in helping shape modern thinking. These great men, Aristotle and Sophocles, to name a few, were not mere storytellers. They didn't spend their days weaving tales just because they wanted to and had nothing to do. They were too good for that, and this is why their Greek myths have withstood the test of time and are relevant until today. In fact, they might still even be relevant 100 years from now. Before I ask you questions about this paragraph, let's make sure that we can pronounce these names. Again, we have, repeat after me, Aristotle and Sophocles. Sophocles. These are a few people who actually wrote Greek myths, but why are we still reading their stories thousands of years later? Well, there's a word that appears at the end of this paragraph, and the word is relevant. Relevant really means it is closely connected. So let me reread those last two sentences that you see in bold. They were too good for that, and this is why their Greek myths have withstood the test of time and are relevant until today. In fact, they might even still be relevant 100 years from now. Now that I know what relevant means, I know that this paragraph is trying to show that we can still connect to Greek myths even though they were written long ago. Let's think about why Greek myths are relevant today as we read the next paragraph. The heading of the next section is titled, What are Greek Myths? To some people, Greek myths are these epic tales of gods and goddesses gallivanting about the earth, achieving all sorts of impossible tasks. They are stories of people dealing with the gods, and either they come out triumphant or they end up bloody and charred or turned into animals and plants. Indeed, a person who doesn't look beyond the surface will think these tales are nothing more than flights of fancy by old storytellers from the past, but a deeper look at the stories will tell you more than that. These myths aren't just legends, and while they are just stories, they are stories with a purpose and a reason. A deeper look at Greek myths should reveal morals, philosophies, and even warnings. Wow, this is a great paragraph for us to analyze because it tells us a lot about the characteristics of Greek myths. What are some of the characteristics of Greek myths that this section has, or that appeared in this paragraph? What do Greek myths almost always have in them? But you're thinking of some good characteristics, so let's put a few on our chart. In the column that says characteristic, I want you to make a bullet point, and I want you to write, well, one, it includes humans. So jot that down in your chart under characteristics. We know that Greek myths include humans, but what else do Greek myths also include? Great job. They also include Greek gods. There's a few more points that I'd like for us to get from this paragraph, so let me reread just a couple of lines. These myths aren't just legends, and while they are just stories, they are stories with a purpose and a reason. A deeper look at Greek myths should reveal morals, philosophies, and even warnings. So what's another characteristic then that we could include back on our chart that was mentioned in those last two sentences? That's right. Greek myths have a purpose or a reason. Sometimes they have a moral or a warning for our readers. So let's make another bullet point and add that Greek myths have a purpose. And sometimes the purpose of a Greek myth is to explain a natural phenomenon. What was the natural phenomenon that was explained in Arachne? Right, we learned about the origin of spiders through that Greek myth. Let's take a look at one more sentence. It says, they are stories of people dealing with the gods, and either they come out triumphant or they end up bloody and charred or turned into animals and plants. Triumphant means victorious or successful. Are the humans in Greek myths always successful? Not really, because in the story of Arachne, we know that she was turned into a spider, so that's not quite a triumphant ending for Arachne. So what we want to have is our chart so far. That paragraph had a lot of information in it, but we're going to move on to the next section. These tales rarely have the happily ever after endings people are so used to these days, but remember, they weren't written for entertainment. They were written with a higher purpose. One wouldn't expect such great minds to waste their time telling a story for the sake of telling a story. They had to have purpose, and they had to impart knowledge. In truth, these myths give people a chance to glimpse at the way the Greeks lived and how they thought back then. It might seem hopelessly outdated and unimportant, but the exact opposite of that is true. What does the phrase there, impart knowledge, mean? They had to impart knowledge. Yeah, they had to give or communicate their knowledge. So the purpose of these stories wasn't necessarily to entertain people, but to impart knowledge. What kind of knowledge do you think is important? Well, think about that as we keep reading. So we have, what is the importance of the Greeks is our next section. Most people will not really notice it unless they are told to do so, but there are so many Greek influences around the world today. In fact, it is impossible to go around to completely understand the basics of things like fine arts, literature, and performing arts without touching on some Greek myth. These myths were an integral part of ancient Greek culture because this was how they passed down lessons from one generation to the next without things getting boring and dull. Anyone who has ever picked up a book on Greek myths or seen a movie inspired by one can attest to its action-packed nature. Some might wonder, what's the point? What the point is to just passing down stories that were made up and were in no way true, but that was the beauty of Greek mythology in ancient times. They became a perfect way to impart lessons without being dull or boring. So I see the word impart there again in the last sentence. Remember what it means? That's right, to give or to communicate lessons without being dull or boring. So when we look back at our chart, I want you to add the last characteristic, which is to impart a lesson. So I want us to think about the types of lessons that myths might impart as we continue to read. The next section is, what did these myths do? Well, these myths were told to people, and it helped them realize the difference between right and wrong. It helped them come to terms with how they should be humble and never think themselves of immortal, or they might just be proven wrong in the most horrible and inopportune of ways. Also, these tales tell people of heroes and how true greatness was achieved by those who dared, while at the same breath showing the flaws of these heroes. Any modern person who reads or hears of Greek myths will be hard-pressed to stay unaffected. They are simply that good, and this proves just how relevant they still are. Anyone can pick up a book of Greek myths. For sure, they will get something from it. Why study Greek myths? Reading and hearing about Greek mythology is one thing, but why are modern people still made to study them? The answer to that is very simple: to learn. People still study the ancient Greeks and their myths much in the same way they study other cultures, and that is so they can learn from it. After all, when you study a culture as progressive as that of the ancient Greeks, you really can't help but learn lessons. These myths, for their part, show modern people a glimpse of how they thought in the past, what they considered important, how their morals worked, etc. Another reason to study those Greek myths is because they have contributed a lot to classic and modern literature in the form of symbols. So we can learn a lot about ancient Greeks by reading their myths. We can figure out what was important to them and how they thought about things. Even if their stories are not scientifically accurate, it's still interesting to see the way that they thought about things. So let's continue reading. It has been said that simply by studying or even just reading some of these myths, people can learn how to control their actions or at least think better of what they do. After all, a lot of these stories tell tales of how human follies, stupidity, and even hubris get people in trouble. In a sense, these myths serve as a warning for people on how they should and should not be. The irony of the situation is that most people still tend to go with their follies, choose to make stupid decisions, and have hubris. It is almost comical how these myths capture human behavior in the ancient times that are still alive and kicking today, meaning they're still relevant. Before we end, I want to make sure that we understand here we have the words follies and hubris. Are these positive or negative words? Yeah, if you said negative, you're correct. We know by the word stupidity here, it helps us understand that those words are negative. And here, the word stupidity helps us understand, or follies, is referring to foolishness, and hubris is referring to arrogance, meaning being too boastful. So we have taken a lot of notes today in the characteristics column. And I want us to think about, before we move to our own myth, the details of Arachne. So I want you to take a moment to fill out the middle column. And if you get stuck, don't worry. So I want you to think about the human that was in Arachne. Who was it? I want you to jot that down. And then I want you to think about the Greek god that was in Arachne. What was her name again? Can you jot that down? Because we know that those are the characteristics of a Greek myth. And think about the purpose of the story. What natural phenomenon did Arachne explain? What animal did the human turn into? That might help you. And what was the overall lesson in Arachne? Because those are the characteristics, again, of a Greek myth. All right, and let's review. Our human was Arachne, and our Greek goddess was Athena. Again, she was the goddess of craftsmen. So now what I want us to do, we're going to pause there. And for the My Myth column, I want you to choose a character for your own story. And we will do that here by looking at these names. You will have to choose a Greek god to include in your Greek myth that you will be writing. So I want you to look at this list of Greek gods and goddesses and think about which one you might want to write about. Just a couple of gods. Apollo was the god of music. Hermes was the god of travel. Poseidon was the god of the sea. Zeus was the god of weather, just to name a few. Aphrodite was the goddess of love and beauty. Athena, the goddess of wisdom. Demeter was the goddess of nature. Persephone was the goddess of spring and flowers. So you are welcome to choose any of these Greek gods or goddesses for your own story. And then next, let's think about the purpose. What was the purpose in Arachne? Great, to explain how spiders came to be. So you're going to be thinking about what natural phenomenon do you want to include in your myth? So, for example, I chose for my story the goddess Iris. And she's going to explain how the rainbow came to be. So how each color came from nature, such as Iris used grass to create green and the seas to create blue. So I want you to take a few seconds to think about how something in nature came to be. Because again, your Greek myth has to have a purpose. And then lastly, your story has to impart a lesson. In Arachne, I think our lesson is to not brag or be very boastful. And so I want you to jot that in the center column for Arachne. Again, Greek myths have lessons that we can learn from. So when you write your Greek myth, be sure to include a lesson in your story. I'm about to read your independent practice for today, so be sure to write down the task. I will read it twice. Again, you are going to write a Greek myth using the characteristics that we studied. Be sure to include a human and a Greek goddess characters, a purpose which explains a natural phenomenon, a lesson, and then of course use what you learned in lesson 2 of this week about exposition, conflict, climax, rising action, and resolution. Again, you're going to write your own Greek myth using the characteristics we studied. Be sure to include a human and a Greek goddess characters, a purpose which explains a natural phenomenon, a lesson, and use what you learned about the plot elements of a story: exposition, climax, conflict, climax, rising action, and resolution. I enjoyed working with you today. I learned so much about the characteristics of Greek myths, and it was fun to see those characteristics in Arachne. Thank you for inviting me into your home. Bye.